Hello again, New York Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views channel. All right, if you guys read Big Blue View, you know that on Wednesday I posted a story basically discussing the Jackson Dart development plan, and some of what's in there came from Matt Waldman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio from a discussion we had before the draft, and I thought. It would be really good to have Matt back on the show so that we could kind of do a deep dive into the NFL, into Jackson Dart, into quarterback development, into sort of why some situations succeed and some don't. So, Matt, welcome back to the show, and as always, I appreciate the time.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. So, hey, Jackson Dart. I know that that you have some concerns regarding Jackson Dart, regarding some of the things that you're worried about him being able to overcome and not develop. Just your thoughts on the Giants, deciding that Dart was the guy that they were going to go in on, with the other choices that were on the board at the time.
Well, I mean, you look at Dart in terms of where I viewed him, he had a score that certainly is worthwhile enough to see how he could become a starter. That's not, that's not a huge concern. It's not like they picked a player that I felt like would be a career backup. Um, but they did pick a player who is probably, relative to the other players in this class, probably realistically the the second the second or third quarterback on the board, depending on how you would view things altogether. So it's not
Mhm.
well out of the range of expectation where they got him. They did follow the traditional kind of NFL playbook of if they smelled just a faint whiff of first round ability in some respect, they were going to go in on that. Where
Right.
I think that and there's the well established views as to why that is. So from that standpoint, I would say that, Dart certainly, you know, he has decent footwork, he has decent release mechanics in terms of his upper body. He has promise in the play action game. He has promise as a decision maker in the short, intermediate, and deep games. The accuracy is where we may have some concerns with him beyond 25 yards.
Mhm.
Tracking that. That's where the big play ability with his arm is something that we're going to need to see a little bit more proof of concept that he can do it consistently, do it after he's avoided pressure, and be a little bit better with some decision making in situations in situational football, which is common with most rookies.
And but that said, I guess if he was the guy that the organization had a consensus on, for them to go get him rather than have regrets of, we missed the guy we wanted, so we'll just try with somebody else. I suppose, um, they probably sleep better at night knowing that this was the guy that they got the guy that they targeted.
I think so. And I think that the tough part is like the optimistic view is that. And I think that there's certainly good reasons to look at it from that optimistic standpoint. It may be a weaker class up top than maybe last year, but again, the way I scored him, he's still a player that I see having starter potential. So it's not, it's not a ridiculous pick. Um, at the same time, if you're looking at it from maybe a pessimist point of view or a skeptic's point of view, you might be looking at this and saying he's on the lower end of that scale. He's um, he's also in a situation where politically, maybe it was really felt like that the GM and the coach felt like they had to find another guy um, to please the executives in the room, and that this was a mandate that maybe needed to happen officially or unofficially, and that if they just came into the season and said, "We don't have a quarterback of the future," after we let Daniel Jones move on, and all we have are two guys who've been with journeyman starters with multiple teams who have, clear flaws in some fashion, that they may feel like that they weren't doing what what the executives wanted them to do on draft day.
Absolutely. I said multiple times throughout the offseason that I supported the the idea of the Giants keeping Joe Shane as GM and Brian Dable as head coach, but that it was sort of an awkward situation because while demanding a better product justifiably after 9-25 the last two seasons, John Mara also said our biggest priority is to find our quarterback of the future. And those two things obviously don't go together specifically for the 2025 season. So it was kind of an awkward situation because the quarterback of the future is a long-term thing, and the you better put a better product on the field is a do what you can, go make a big bid for Matthew Stafford, whatever you've got to do.
Yeah, it felt like a disconnect, really, and that's to me, if you're looking at it from an operations standpoint, the operations staff who with their feet on the ground, and then maybe mid-level management, if you really want to call a GM a mid-level manager, but compared to the owner, he is. Um,
Hmm.
they feel, to me, I feel like they have a more realistic understanding of what's going on, whereas the owner is kind of can be cast in the demanding. I'm more removed from the situation. I don't understand what the quarterback class looks like. I don't understand what the quarterback class may look like next year. I may not really even care because I'm going to pick out exceptions to the rule and hold it in the face of this staff. And I'm just tired, frankly, of being 9-25 over that period of time and don't care about the reasons. I'm just going to view them as excuses, and I'm going to play semi-informed manager hardball with my staff, which is what you see a lot with the NFL. Maybe a little bit of a lack, maybe patience thinning, or wearing down a little bit from that standpoint. Now, there may be some validity with some of the things that we've seen behind the scenes, where when those statements are made, there's more to it going on. But I would, from the surface, I would look at it and say, Brian Dable didn't draft Daniel Jones. Um,
Right.
well, Shane didn't draft Daniel Jones. Dave Gettleman bought the bill of goods. Excuse my bluntness for that. That was Daniel Jones in terms of they bought that he was a Manning like prospect. And as we've talked on here years ago, the Duke program or that coached him, certainly their head coach trained the Mannings, worked with them, but not in but he was working with them as a quarterback coach. He was the head coach for Daniel Jones. Very different scenario. And as Duke mentioned, the staffers some staffers there that talked to scouts who actually asked, they said it's a different Cutcliffe coached prospect because he didn't really give them that level of attention and care. He's a head coach now, but scouts love the idea and teams love the idea of the tag of the Cutcliffe coach quarterback that's Daniel Jones. And we're playing that up from a marketing standpoint to get recruits because we know if we get a guy who's drafted in the first round by an NFL team, we're going to get more recruits. We don't care we care as a person whether he makes it or not, but we're not as invested in that as an NFL team is. We just know we're going to get the benefit of having a quarterback drafted in the first round that we can sit on parents' couches and talk to players and say, we just sent a quarterback to the first round of the draft. David Cutcliffe's coached Peyton, Eli, and Daniel Jones. And from that point of view, that's all equal. We know that that's far from equal. And I think that from what I was told, about half the league bought into the idea that he was a true Cutliff coached quarterback who was ready like the Mannings. And the other half of the league had asked the questions, and the question was, yeah, not really. And I think
Mhm.
that, is that, you could say, is that fair for Dable and Shane? No, but is that par for the course? And you got to work with what you got, and this is part of the expectation of the league. Yes. So, it's just one of those layers to consider here. And I think that if they are going to be a little bit more patient, they would probably say, if you don't think you like the quarterback, maybe we won't trade up to get him. But at the same time, maybe the interviews, maybe what they saw on tape, they felt like this was a player who had more upside and value than what he showed on film in college, and that his best football was yet to come. And there's reasons to see how that could be the case for Jackson Dart. It's just that his downside is probably a little bit as just as much pronounced as his upside. And with first round picks, you kind of like to see it be that his downside isn't as pronounced. The potential downside is as pronounced. But again, you know, we looked at Dable, and he did have Josh Allen, and Josh Allen had, I would say, even a lower downside than what Jackson Dart did if he was mishandled. So there's some reason for hope there.
All right, so let's talk about the Giants and let's talk about Jackson Dart and let's just talk about the landing spot. We talked about this some, in our pre-draft discussion, but just as we know situation matters. Situation mattered for Sam Darnold. Situation matters for every quarterback. Mattered for Caleb Williams last year. Um, it mattered for Jaden Daniels. It matters for everybody. Um, is this the sum total of its parts with a head coach who's on the hot seat? Perhaps, although he's got a reputation as a good quarterback coach, a good offensive guy with some other good offensive people like Mike Kafka around him. Is is this a landing spot that in your mind gives Jackson Dart a good chance to reach whatever his ceiling might be?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we got to start with coaching, okay? And the what's true and what's maybe more perception about coaches. And it's not anything personal about Mike Kafka or Brian Dable or any of the staff. It's what I'm going to talk about is a tendency across the league, because we tend to judge who's who are good coaches. Now, good coaches could be they're good at putting a game plan together. They're good at motivating um, players. They're good at working within the scheme to find things that the players do well. They're good at adjusting from that standpoint. They're good at noting things that a player can work on to do their job. And they're good at organization. There's a lot of different things you could talk about. But one thing that is commonly the case with the NFL is that players don't get coached up on their skills to become better at their position to the extent that most people assume. Um, and generally, because there's so much time put into scheme and game plan. That's the vast majority of ours. But what happens often is that, you know, I was talking to Dan Hatman, who's a regular guest on your shows. Dan's a friend of mine, and we were having this conversation a few weeks ago. And one of the things that he brought up is that when he's talked with people, is that often is the case is that when they're in rooms determining who they're going to pick, usually scouts may ask somebody in that room, ask a coach, or the GM or an owner, can you coach this player up? We are thinking about, we really like this guy and his potential. Can you coach him up? And they usually ask it as a yes no question. And the the coach says yes, almost
Invariably,
always. Yes,
always. Yes.
because they were put on the spot to do
Mhm.
so. Now,
Right.
Dan asked this person, a veteran of the league in a lot of decision making circles, instead, have you ever heard anybody ask the coach, um, how long will it take for the player to learn what it is that he needs to learn to be ready? And what percentage of success do you think there is for him to actually learn those things? And the person who was listening to this lit up and said, I have never heard anyone pose the question that way. Which sounds simple, but it's, sometimes the profound things are simple that way. So the point being is that when it comes to processing information faster, when it comes to getting your footwork tighter, when it comes to resetting your feet in a manner where you can deliver with better accuracy, tightening up your release motion, um, looking at coverage and identifying coverage faster, understanding, looking at leverage and manipulating and learning how to maneuver a pocket more efficiently and identifying pre-snap, post-snap stuff. Some of the classroom work things they're going to be learning because they're in the with the team, because the team's expanding their minds with the possibilities that happen with NFL defenses. So they're learning about it, and they're learning maybe the theory on how to do it, but the actual, we're going to
The
coach you, break this down, spend the time on the field, in a film room, and actually figure out the best way to learn it, the fastest way to process it, and the most efficient way to execute it. That's on the quarterback. And if they're fortunate, they have quarterbacks in the room who are either willing to work with them, and most, but also they are self-aware enough to realize that it's not um, wrong for them to access that help. And
right.
oftentimes these young players don't do that. A good example is you can go to, if you've got streaming services, you can go to MGM and watch NFL Icons. And you can watch Steve Young explain how in 1991 he was having a horrific season after backing up Joe Montana for years, and he was starting and he was not playing well, and he was really frustrated, and he started reading Stephen Covey's books, the business books, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He started reading all this stuff, and he actually had an opportunity to speak with Covey. And Covey said, well, usually, he goes, tell me about your environment. He goes, well, there's Bill Walsh, who's, probably 7 years ahead of every other coach right now in terms of what he does. Um, I have Joe Montana, who is probably the best quarterback in football right now, and we have a dynasty of a caliber team around me. And he goes, so you're frustrated, you feel hopeless, but from what I'm hearing and comparing it to corporate situations that I've heard about thousands of times, you are in a unicorn situation. You're in a situation where you may not want to hear this, but you're in a situation to find out just how good you can really be. Um, and you're looking at it with the glass half empty. Have you thought about asking Joe Montana to be your mentor? And it dawned on him. Now, he had been there for years, but it dawned on him only after he begins starting, that maybe he should start picking Joe Montana's brain and looking at him as a bigger resource than just observing. And we're talking about 2 Hall of Fame players. Talking about one of them who threw 6 touchdowns and broke Montana's record in the Super Bowl on a dynasty team. So I think it's important to note all that in the context of saying that a lot of this is still incumbent upon the quarterback, how mature they are, and sometimes they have to be mature beyond their years, how good of a um, group of people they have around them who are not a part of the facility, and to really do a lot of this work. But on the side of the Giants, you can look at this and say, this is a good situation if you're going to just compare it to every other situation that still has the problems I just described. Okay. Like if that's the
Mhm.
average environment, the good thing is that Jackson Dart has two veteran quarterbacks to observe. Well, one of them who has won a Super Bowl and was a play away from winning a second Super Bowl, who has been a Pro Bowl player, um, who has played on three different teams now, and has shown that he can still play good football. He is with another quarterback who was a first overall pick, a first round pick with expectations in terms of Jameis Winston, or at least I don't know if he was first overall, but he was first round pick like Jackson. Okay. Who it didn't work out for him as well as they hoped. And he's played with multiple teams and he's had to figure out how to um, make his game better after he had a failed term in Tampa Bay and started working at things away from the game with his footwork that he wasn't working on in Tampa and saw some success with that. So you have two different leadership styles because quarterback is a performance profession. Football is a performance profession, especially with the high-end processing positions that require a lot of high-end processing. So it's not so much a science craft, a science-oriented craft, as much as it is a performance-oriented craft. There's theory and there's technique and there's science behind those things, but there's also how confident are you in reacting and acting on what you identify? How willing are you to take risks and doing it at the point where you should be taking those risks? Or are you being so mathematical that every good that you're following the right answer in theory to the point that every play is a check down and now you're correct technically, but who would you rather have, Alex Smith or Brett Favre? They're on polar ends, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of taking chances and how well they knew the game theoretically. But Brett Favre was a high-end processor. Alex Smith was a below average processor for a starter, and you could see how that turned out. One had 3 MVPs and a Super Bowl win, and
Mhm.
played into his 40s. The
Right.
other, played and was a tough kid and played, was able to be a journeyman starter, first tier backup. And I think that that's where we're at with Dart is that he has the quarterbacks to watch and observe from a leadership standpoint, how they develop, to pick their brains. He has a coach in Brian Dable who has successfully seen or at least stewarded the ship as much as he could with Josh Allen and be able to use those examples of how bad Allen looked in the beginning and what he was able to do and be able to provide anecdotes for Dart to understand that and see a path for development and adjusting to what the guy can do right now and give him confidence in that. And then, be able to have realistic expectations for how to ramp him up. And if he's not doing the minimum things that Dable's at requiring of this offense, he's not doing it well. That will be a problem. But he won't be like, let's just put you in and sink or swim time, like Adam Gase would say, Zach Wilson, where Zach Wilson comes onto the sideline is like I'm seeing ghosts, and Gase looks like he's frozen stiff with fear and not even like responding to his quarterback on the sideline at
Mhm.
all, and just letting him hang out there to dry. I don't think Dable's that kind of guy. So to me, while there's still misconceptions about coaching up a player, what they do, what most teams actually do that Dart is in probably a better situation than many.
Right, I think you were referring to Sam Darnold, not Zach Wilson, but your point is well
Yeah,
taken because neither
yeah,
one of them ended up doing well with the Jets, and
yes,
I think, what I was thinking about, and you mentioned it, but the physical parts of playing quarterback, the the footwork, the mechanics, the arm angle, those kinds of, whatever physical parts of playing quarterback you may need to clean up are probably not things you're going to go clean up in the OTAs or training camp or whatever, because that's not what your team is working on. Your team is working on, these coaches are trying to figure out what the roster is going to be, so they need to see performance, and then once they figure out the roster, they're getting ready for games. So they're not focused on the third string quarterback's footwork. They're just not. That you go work on that with your personal quarterback coach in the offseason. Your coaches, your NFL coaches may help you identify that and say these are the things you need to get better at. But you take those to your personal coach in the offseason and figure those things out. Um, One of the things that Brian Dable gets a lot of credit for the development of Josh Allen. And people say, well, how much of that was Josh Allen? How much of that was Brian Dable? And in the with people that I've talked to and the research that I've done is interesting because it touches on a lot of the things that you have talked about. You know, Josh Allen got more accurate from his first couple of years, but that wasn't necessarily Brian Dable's doing.
right.
That wasn't necessarily Brian Dable fixing his footwork or fixing his arm slot or fixing the touch that he throws on the ball. In terms of developing Josh Allen, what what the Bills did was put the right resources around him for Josh Allen to learn. And the other thing that Brian Dable did was invest enough of himself into Josh Allen that he didn't say, "Well, this is the way I run my offense, and you need to learn it." Brian Daboll, as offensive coordinator in Buffalo, put years into learning Josh Allen, what made him tick, what got him going, what did he like to do, what did he like to run, what kind of players did he need around him. And they came to like a Vulcan mind meld of this is how we work. This is how it works. It's not necessarily the offensive coordinator fixing everything. It's the offensive coordinator being flexible enough to learn that player and learn what will make him, the best he can be.
That's really well stated, and I'll give you some examples with Brian Dable because if you look at year 1 in Buffalo with Josh Allen, when you saw Josh Allen coming out, you saw a player who had the potential to become a good pocket quarterback, but tended to bleed way too much time in the pocket to the point that he made mistakes, that he would try and force throws with the big arm, that he would not pay attention to managing red zone and black zone plays and would take negative plays that he could have avoided. That if the longer he held on the ball, the more determined he was to make a big play. But when he was doing things in rhythm, when he could see the field clearly, you had these moments of, wow, that looks very refined. And then coupled with the big arm and the athletic ability, it's about kind of calibrating everything together and learning when and how to balance it. So in Dable's case, year one, they they didn't, they wanted him to be a pocket quarterback who could run. So ultimately, that was their goal, is to utilize his gifts that way. They didn't put him in a lot of RPO situations. They didn't decide we're going to use you as a runner a lot and have you do what Lamar Jackson does or Jalen Hurts did early. We're going to put you in shotgun. And if you don't see that second read clearly or that third read clearly, just run. We're not worried
Mhm.
about it right now. We want you to be decisive, and then we want you to expand your game outward from there." Because their thought is, we want to have a player who doesn't lose his confidence, who doesn't overthink, but we can gradually expand how he's seeing the game without running into these issues that can slow your game down, cost you your confidence, and you end up losing the very essence of what makes you a good performer. So, first year, first read not open, run. He did a lot of that. Second year, they were like, okay, it's got the same offensive system, but let's let's get Stefon Diggs in here. I don't know if it was second year or third year, but they eventually got Stefon Diggs in there. They eventually started running more routes where it wasn't routes that terminated back to the quarterback, like comebacks and sticks and stop routes or anything that or tight outs to the boundary where literally it's like you've got to hit that on time and it's got to be with great anticipation and you've got to have a good feel from coming to one read to the next with perfect timing. They knew that that wasn't probably the best thing for Josh Allen to do right away, and more often they wanted to run routes that crossed the field that had multiple windows of opportunity for Allen to throw the ball because they knew that maybe Allen might buy more time than he would sit in the pocket and make the quick decision. He was more apt to bleed time. And with that happening, the routes across the field complemented what he did well because you don't want to, if he didn't do because he didn't do the the other timing routes with the one termination point as well, why put a bunch of those routes in the system when you know that that's something he's got to continue to grow into? Instead, leverage your receiver's athletic ability, leverage your quarterback's athletic ability, and give him multiple chances to succeed as a shot. And they did that, and you could see he'd have success. His confidence grew as he continued working at his craft away from the facility. Guess what? Everything's becoming more efficient. He doesn't have to think as much. You can put more timing routes into the game plan and start doing more of the things that he could do but wasn't quite as good doing, and that could easily fall apart if the confidence wasn't there, if the ability to read and and process as fast was temporarily slowed down. Because what we need to understand about development is that even though you may do something well in college, once the situation around you in the pros becomes more complex, whether it's maybe you're running a flood concept, but maybe there's different types of tags or options that your offense puts into place in the pros than what they ran in college. And it's not as simple. Maybe it's that the the different route adjustments and hot routes and things like that and option routes maybe are the same as your college offense, but now the pass rush is getting there faster. It's better disguised. The offense, the the pre-snap, post-snap trickery is different, and the athletes are more punishing. And those things get amped up enough that now you're thinking about things you weren't thinking about at Wyoming with the same concept, but now everything slows down because you're overthinking. You're not performing to the speed of instinct. And as a result, things that you had down when you ran this concept, like your footwork, your arm, your release motion, your ability to manipulate a defender, your ability to recognize certain things is all slowed down. And now you start making mistakes. You're like, my feet haven't looked this bad since 11th grade. I mean,
Mhm.
those things happen because again, you're going through that acclimation period. So when a team is able to do what Dable did in Buffalo, they minimized those types of mistakes so that he was able to slowly move forward and not have as much moving, 4 steps backwards, 2 steps forward, 5 steps backwards, 1 step forward. It's more of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 4 steps forward, and you're still trending upward. And I think that that's where Dable and the offense give you some hope for a player like Jackson Dart.
Right, and that's not necessarily developing a player's physical skills. That's allowing a player to develop on the mental side. He may develop his physical skills elsewhere, but you're developing the player's understanding and you're developing your own understanding of the player.
Yeah, because if you
And
can't
and and that's where you get success is when both of those things come together. When the player understands what he's seeing and doing, and when you have invested the time and the effort to understand the player and what will make him succeed.
yeah, I mean, because let's look at it this way. I look at Cam Ward as an example. You watch his drop footwork, and we talked about it, I think, was that it's when you watch it, it wasn't very fluid at Miami. It wasn't very fluid at Washington State. There were a lot of,
Mhm,
he could do 2, 3-step, 5-step, um, 3-step punch drops. He could do a 7-step drop off of play action. And some of those drops were fluid. Some of those looked like someone who was speaking in halting sentences. And the rhythm was off at various times. But you could also see him execute some footwork where he was sliding away from pressure and being able to do some advanced footwork techniques where he was able to keep his body in a position. And some people look at it like it was a double step and some weird mechanical flaw, but it's actually a taught technique. So you see that he's getting instruction. The thing is that while his footwork may not be as clean as you would like to see it coming out, if you have trouble at this level learning 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7-step drops, there's something wrong.
mhm.
It's fairly basic. It's just a matter of spending the time and taking the time to do it. And some guys, maybe what's wrong is that they won't take the time to refine their game and practice some of the fundamentals and sharpen them up. But those types of things, yeah, off the field with quarterback specific coaches who work with that. Would it be nice that teams took the time to do this type of work and maybe were more patient with quarterbacks and gave them the time to really refine their games before they even considered putting them on a field? Would the overall product be better? Some would say in theory, yes. But I would argue that just like most quarterbacks, top quarterbacks say, the best thing, the most important about quarterbacking is between the ears. It's not the body. There's a baseline level of skill with the body and the arm talent, but after that, the difference making is in between the ears. So, that's still that performance and processing and leadership. That's the part that's still kind of the final frontier for development and evaluation.
And it's so interesting because, you've seen it, I've seen it, and we talked about it a little bit. You get coaches who say, "This is my scheme." "This is my scheme, this is how we do it." And, if player X can't do it, we just toss player X aside and bring in player Y, and we try it that way. Um, the best coaching is coaching that isn't married to doing things one way. And, it figures out what the players do, and I know for the Giants this year, that's a challenge on the defensive side of the ball because they've brought in all this defensive talent, and now people are like, "Well, you got 3 linebackers for 2 spots, and you got X number of defensive tackles for 2 or 3 spots, so how are you gonna use them all?" Well, that's Shane Bowen's problem to figure out, but that's the same thing on the offensive side and the same thing with quarterbacks. Let me ask you this, Matt. I've crunched the numbers since 2010, and I might have talked to you about this the last time we spoke, but if you define quarterbacks, a year or so ago, Bill Barnwell of ESPN did a thing where he put together 5 categories of quarterbacks, basically from Hall of Famer to Pro Bowl to the mid-level was solid starter, and then basically it was journeyman and it was failure, period, something along that line. And I crunched the numbers from 2010 forward, and if you go leading up to this draft, I think it was less than 40% of the quarterbacks drafted in the first round that you could actually qualify as at least a solid starter in the NFL, which if you're drafting a guy in the first round and you don't get that, that's not good at all. That's awful. Um, I can you is there a short way to summarize why the NFL is so bad at developing these quarterbacks? And is it development? Is it identifying? Is it putting these guys in the right situation? Is it some of all of that?
Some of all of it. Their form of development is the John Wayne School of Swimming for boys. If you watched Hondo way back in the day, if you're our age and or older, then you know the scene where the kid doesn't know how to swim and John Wayne throws him into the creek and says,
And
"Figure
says,
it out."
figure it out.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
basically what the NFL does with these quarterbacks. Um, so there is, if you're going to talk about development from the standpoint of giving on-site training to actually learn the craft of playing the position, you would probably give them a D to a D minus across the league on that. If you're going to talk about getting prepared for scheme and getting prepared for game plan, then you'd probably give them a B to B plus to an A for that. Um, in terms of the um, evaluating, I would say they probably get a C minus to a D on that, and mainly because there's a couple things. They don't fail necessarily because from what we've seen, while that hit rate for a first round quarterback is low, it's even lower in the succeeding rounds. Now you could say part of that is that it's due to the fact that the talent is there, but the development skills by the NFL side are not. And because when the coach says, "Yeah, I can develop them," and then the coach doesn't spend the time with the player to do it, they blame the player. That's generally what happens because it's just they're passing the buck. They said yes because they felt like they had to say yes to keep their job, even though the
Mhm.
demands in no way allow that. So there's part of it's that. But I would say the biggest opportunity that's missing here are 2 things. One is that while you can play the whole economics game of percentages and say that if you have a quarterback that you think has first round of talent, you at least have to take the chance, even if 38% is low or bad, it's still a lot higher than everywhere else. Well, you could say that, but maybe they're self-limiting in the wrong way because they tend to look for certain physical traits, certain Bill Parcells had the old method that he used, and while Bill was a
Mhm.
great, great coach and certainly gave a simple kind of shorthand for some common sense esque types of things, I would take issue with some of the things that he brought up, like now that we've gotten further into the game, because like 62% completion percentage, you know, if you're charting games, you could look at a guy like Lamar Jackson and realize that his completion percentage would be much higher, or Brock Purdy's completion percentage would be much higher if the receivers caught the balls they were supposed to and the balls bounced off their hands. So if you're charting, you might want to say charted completion percentage and refine that type of thing. But the thing is that owners seem to have this idea of what they want. And so it can be they have to be a certain height, they have to be a certain weight, they had to come from a certain size program, they had to be able to play winning football in terms of win-loss record. They they have to look a certain way. They have to display certain leadership characteristics that they define as good leadership, which may not be necessarily the case. And so there's a lot of biases built into what is a first round caliber prospect that may or may not really matter and may not be as important as other things. But now they've X'd it out before they've even considered some of the players. It's kind of like Russell Wilson. If we looked back on it, we probably would have said is a first round quarterback, a guy who's been to multiple Pro Bowls, who has taken their team to the playoffs most years and won a Super Bowl. And and came within a play of another. And you'd probably say, yeah, it's probably he'd be a first round quarterback compared to a lot of the guys that were drafted in the first round that never came close to that career. You would probably say I would have rather taken him, you know?
Mhm.
And so I think what happens is that teams where the opportunity lies is that teams also need to understand what's important because for some of the things that they think are important are whiteboard knowledge. Like how quickly they can spit back a play call. The John Gruden stuff. Oh, let me give you a long play call. Can you spit it right back out to me and recall that? Do you remember do you remember this play back in week 3 on film and what the coverage looked like and what they could have done, like the Sean McVay parlor trick? Can you remember that kind of stuff? Sure, it's nice to have good recall. That's important, especially with all the plays that you can run in a playbook. But what's more important, that or that you can execute it quickly on the field, that you identify and see things fast? Because there's a lot of guys that now they've self-selected to the point that it's like to the point where they're great on the whiteboard, but they cannot act that stuff out when they see it on the field quick
Well,
enough.
I I almost hate to do this, but I think of Daniel Jones for the simple reason you and I talked about this years and years ago when the Giants drafted Daniel Jones. And you used the phrase with Daniel Jones, you called him a robo quarterback.
Yep.
And I'll never forget that. And what you said to me was, and I think it applies to this whiteboard stuff because Daniel Jones is an incredibly intelligent, well-spoken young man who, as you said, he had all of those Eli Manning type characteristics that appealed to the Mara family and the Duke connection and Cutcliffe and all of that. Daniel Jones was absolutely fine until a play broke down to the point where he couldn't do exactly what the play was designed to do. If it was drop back, throw to your first read's open, you get to set your feet, you've got time to do it, he's fine. But it's when, it was when the other things started to happen. When he had to go to the second read, the third read, when he had to quote unquote throw a guy open with anticipation that things started to break down. And I think that's the kind of stuff that you're talking about. Whiteboard and writing it on a chalkboard or tracing it out on your computer is one thing. Being able to go out there on the field and react to what's going on is completely different.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at it, it's like you can if you can get on the whiteboard and identify cover 2, cover 3, robber, whatever, different types of zone blitzes, fire zone blitzes, different types of indications of things, but can you notice when a player's disguising something a half second before or revealing the disguise a half second before the snap? Do you know where you should be looking before the snap to see where that disguise might be? Do you know do you know how to be on the same page with your receivers with the hot or the adjustment in that scenario? And can you combine all the things you learned on the whiteboard with your footwork, with your pocket movement when something breaks down at the line to be able to make one or two small steps and fire the ball off angle and still be able to throw the receiver open against that coverage and fit it where it needs to be and do it on time? A lot of quarterbacks can do a lot of those things but not do it on time. Desmond Ritter was great at the whiteboard. That was what impressed people. Kenny, you know, Kenny Pickett, great at the whiteboard. But when things caught them off guard, they couldn't see the field well enough to react quickly and
Mhm.
that's and accurately within that quick period of time. And that's again a processing thing. They see processing as an academic processing. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. Can you divide 49 by 7? Can you do the square root of, whatever, 144? And they start trying to apply these things, but that's all academic. It's not motor skills and motor intelligence. That's a different form of intelligence. And they're trying to do it with S2 and they're trying to do it with different types of testing, and maybe they'll get there with that. But we've seen that it's still not there, and we're seeing that when it applies to the field, again, we bring up Brett Favre as the example. The dude didn't know what cover two was until he asked Ty Detmer, like his second or third year as a starter, and he won 3 MVPs. And he would basically was the creator of the RPO, okay, because he processed information well enough to go, maybe we should create something else in response to what defenses are doing to me, and he essentially was the godfather of the RPO. It wasn't a coach, it was his on-field acumen, same guy who again, maybe threw a lot of interceptions, but you notice that came up with big games and often played lights out. And whether you love him or hate him or don't like what he is off the field, you can't deny the fact that he was a quick processor who understood that, as the way I put it, is that quarterbacking is like the equivalent of playing chess in the middle of a barroom brawl on biker night. Okay. That's basically what quarterbacking is. And so you have the academics and theory of chess, but you got to be creative, and
Mhm.
there's a little, and the rules change as you're going. And sometimes you realize that the object of the game is not only to win it, but maybe survive the room. And
Mhm.
I think that that's the kind of thing that quick processors do well, and they're not afraid to make mistakes, because in performers make mistakes all the time, you know, unless it's like, especially in improvisational type of performance, okay? Not classical music, where that sometimes happens too, but people have studied the same song for hundreds of years, and they know every note by note and what it should be the way it is. But improvised music, oftentimes people listen to and don't realize that there were maybe 5 mistakes going on in the past 30 seconds, but because the musicians were so good at adjusting and creating and mitigating the problem and creating music out of it, turning lemons into lemonade, as I would say, that most people wouldn't notice that the bass player was a half measure ahead, of the form of the tune, and that the drummer was off playing with the piano player, or that the piano player hit the wrong chord, or that the saxophonist actually like played a outlined a different chord and it sounded a little weird, but because they could adjust well, they turned it into something that actually sounded great, but it wasn't the intent. And quarterbacks do that. The best quarterbacks do that, and that's something, and sometimes it looks like it all happened on script or it stayed close to the structure. I'm not talking, John Elway's crazy flights of fancy or Favre's crazy flights of fancy. I'm talking about maybe Tom Brady saying, "Yeah, the receiver was supposed to do this, but I realized he was making the mistake at the top of my 3-step drop, and I just threw it behind him because I knew that's what he was going to do based on how he was making the mistake. I anticipated his mistake and made him look like he made the right play." Those are the types of things that we don't always see, but those are the things or know until they talk about it. People go, "Oh, that's amazing." And you go, "Yeah, but that's what top end quarterbacking is." And so that's the part the NFL, I think, has difficulty with and will always have difficulty with.
I want to tell you a quick non-quarterback story because it applies to this whole thing about coaches and organizations. When you remember how upset the Giants fan base was years ago when the Giants gave Odell Beckham the big contract. And Dave Gettleman pounded his chest and, said, I didn't sign him to trade him. Well, a year later, he traded Odell Beckham. And he was still saying, I didn't sign him to trade him. It was just something that, as it worked out, this is something that we had to do. And what I know about that situation is had Dave Gettleman had his way, the Giants never would have given Odell Beckham that big contract. They would have moved on from Odell Beckham when they hired Pat Shermer. But Pat Shermer, in his second year as head coach, said, I can coach Odell Beckham. I can get him to fall in line. I can make it work with Odell Beckham. And of course, we found out relatively quickly that that wasn't going to be the case. So, what happens, I think, and what I want you to speak to when we talk about development, when we talk about putting quarterbacks in the right situations, getting them to the right places because situation matters. The fact that Brian Dable and Josh Allen were able to come together to figure something out, not just, Allen was what he was and Dable was what he was, and they worked at sort of opposite ends. But what I want to ask you about is how often does this fail because organizations simply aren't honest with themselves about maybe what they are, what they have, what they can do, what their own situation is, and whether or not they might be ready to input this young quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably a very high rate, and I can't say for sure, but from talking with scouts and talking with people in the league, and these situations come up a lot, is that often the pressure to put the player on the field before he's ready is pretty high. And it's usually from ownership or a GM who feels under pressure to do that, feels there's a demand for that player to be on the field and they've invested an early round pick, and that there's an expectation from the outside that they need to play that early round player, and that it generates some level of renewed excitement temporarily for that player to succeed. And then without and if they're hands off the organization in terms of, you do what I say when I tell you what to do, but I'm not going to say it very often as an owner, but they don't have an understanding of the context of why the team wants to hold weight on the player. They may feel like, well, let's get the player on here because look at look at CJ Stroud. He came in right away and played well. You know, look at Ben Roethlisberger. That used to be the ongoing excuse, 15, 20 years ago, was Ben Roethlisberger ruined it for quarterbacks because he came on the field early and played well. And now owners felt like, we don't need to develop them. Look what the Steelers did, and that kind of rationale sometimes plays into it. So I think that overall, um, these players get rushed into duty because there's media pressure that or I don't wouldn't even call it media pressure. The media talks about it because it gets attention. They're doing their job, but the owners feel pressured, and sometimes their level of pressure, I would argue, is not very good leadership. Like, you're the owner. You run a billion-dollar organization. You are some of the richest people on the planet, and you've supposedly had success elsewhere, probably in many cases. Why are you why are you listening to some auto dealer, some third-rate auto dealer in the steam room of your golf club, ragging on you about what Skip Bayless had to say?
Not a
Like,
picture I
really?
wanted, Matt. Not a picture I
Me
wanted.
me neither, but I can't get it out of my head because it's been told to me, okay? Do you really, but this is what happens. I mean, look, whatever you think about politics, I'm just stating that, is it possible is it is it possible that, Jimmy Haslam drafted Shador Sanders because Donald Trump tweeted about somebody needs to draft him and that he's a supporter of Donald Trump and he wanted to look good doing it? Well, I would say that makes no sense whatsoever to do that. But I would also argue that Jimmy Haslam also drafted Baker Mayfield for all the hype that not Baker Mayfield, Johnny Manziel, for all the hype that Johnny Manziel had. But they went to his pro day, and we find out on Netflix that he and his teammates who were going to work out with him on his pro day workout all got hammered the night before and were passed out that morning just before it was time for them to get on the field, and that Manziel had to work with accountants and assistants for his agency to throw the ball to them. He wasn't even throwing the ball to football players, you know? And if you're a Brown scout, I doubt very seriously the Cleveland Brown scout looked at that and said anything other than, "Are we sure we really wanna draft this guy?" Um, I would think they would have said, "There's no way we should draft this guy." Um,
Right.
but has this was a Haslam pick. Um, so is it possible that he did that? Yes. In the same way it was possible. I'll give you a perfect couple other examples, and they've been highlighted. You can go to a Mike Silver article based on with Sports Illustrated where Phil Rosano, um, whose dad was the head scout for Bill Walsh with the 49ers. Okay. That part of putting together that dynasty. And he was at that time, the son grew up in those rooms and was a pretty good scout himself. He was scouting for the Rams when they were in St. Louis. And Alex Smith had that pro day where Gil Brandt gushed like it was the best thing he saw since Troy Aikman. Again, these are scripted throwing rehearsals. These are not any acts of processing. It's just, literally, I don't understand the use of the pro day to this level, the way people do it. But he talked about it. He was all over TV talking about how great it was. And apparently, I believe it was the president of the organization who either upon directive or in his own mind decided that we need to draft Alex Smith. So he comes downstairs to the basement where the scouts were and says, "Listen, I know you've done your due diligence on Smith, but I've got new material that I want you to look at. And I want you to throw away those scouting reports, and I want you to just grade what's on this tape and give me the grades of that." They put in the tape. It was literally the precursor to a YouTube hit clip of 20 highlight plays. Okay. And of course, the scouts reacted and said, "What are you talking about? I'm not doing that. This is a hit clip. This is not real football in terms of like what scouting is about. I've scouted this player for 3 years. We have him as a fourth round pick or a fifth round pick. We've got backups who graded higher than this guy. And you want me to throw all that away to do this?" And he's like, "Why are you being uncooperative?" And started trying to like berate and him and Rosano apparently had to be separated in the room. And this is what Rosano told Mike Silver at Sports Illustrated back in the day. My buddy Phil Russ Landy was there. He was a Rams scout at the time. Corroborated that story. And you look at the Titans. The Titans when they drafted Vince Young, Norm Chow was their new coordinator. USC, he was out of USC before that. He wanted Matt Leinart, his quarterback, of course. That was the new hire. The staff, Jeff Fisher and his coach and his scouts, they wanted Jay Cutler. They had seen him. He was a local kid. Um, probably the highest rated of the three, if you ask me, at least from when I graded them. And then the owner, last minute, like in the 11th hour, like within like a week before the draft, basically told the staff, "Nope, I want to take Vince Young." And according to people inside the organization, the rumor and the thought was that he was so mad that the city of Houston basically told him to get moving and leave Houston that he just wanted to flip the bird to the state of Texas and take their guy, take their, and that was that. And but that the majority of the team, the people who were going to do the operations, were going to have Jay Cutler. Now you could look at Jay Cutler and say he didn't have such a great starting career, but Jay Cutler was a Pro Bowl quarterback in his second year under Mike Shanahan. And Shanahan had called Jeff Fisher before the draft because he wanted Matt Leinart, but he agreed with I'm trying to remember the name of the GM at that time. He told me this story. The former GM of the Broncos during the Shanahan era, and he basically said Sunquist, Phil,
Mm.
Sunquist,
Ted
and
Sunquist.
Ted
Yep.
Sunquist, and Ted said, "Listen, we liked Cutler, But Shanahan wanted Leinart, and we came to an agreement that if Leinart wasn't going to be available, would he take Cutler? And he called Fisher, and Fisher said, "Yeah, we love him, so but we're probably not going to end up taking him." Um, so they ended up taking Cutler, and Cutler started midway through his first year, had a Pro Bowl second year. They knew he was not ready. Like they knew, I say not ready. They knew he was not a complete refined quarterback yet, even after the Pro Bowl season, and that there was work to do with him. But Shanahan moved on, and they hired um, Josh McDaniel. And the story goes, according to Ted Sundquist, that Josh McDaniel had their first conference call with Jay Cutler, and Jay Cutler and his agent were in the room with Ted Sundquist, and the phone, they answer the phone, and it's McDaniel. They have the little introductory, and before they could even get rolling, Josh is already laying into Jay, talking about how bad he is as a player, that he's not a good quarterback, and not doing it in like direct terms. He's doing it in derogatory terms, and just berates him like angrily for like 10 minutes straight, and then just hangs up. And Cutler turns and looks at his agent and said, "Get me out of here. I'm not playing here." And so they ended up trading him to the Bears that summer. And the Bears were bought the idea that Cutler was a complete quarterback when the team knew that they still had work to do with him. And so he
Mhm.
kind of got thrown into the fire more, and his career never ended up the way it could have been. So just you get the idea of just these three stories in some ways of what happens when somebody gets in their mind that they want a certain thing, and they're playing fantasy football with their own organization. And I hear from scouts more often than not that oftentimes these questionable decisions we see come down to the fact that teams they spend all this money on scouts and personnel people to do all this due diligence work, and then at the last minute somebody decides, I want to do this, and for the reasons that your mind is absolutely blown.
Right.
you
Has
know
nothing to do with football. And Matt, the Cutler story is why y- when you think about Jackson Dart, just bringing this back to Dart, why I have my fingers crossed that things work out well for the Giants in 2025 with Brian Dable, because we've talked about Daniel Jones, but the Giants put Daniel Jones through the ringer. 3 head coaches in 6 years, 2 general managers, 5 different play callers. In the Joe Judge era, after a rookie year where Daniel Jones showed some promise, all Joe Judge cared about was that he didn't throw the ball to the other team and that he didn't fumble it. Didn't care what plays he actually made as long as he didn't throw the ball to the other team. And Joe basically spent 2 years beating any desire to make plays down the field out of Daniel Jones's head. Um, so just for the sake of Jackson Dart, for the sake of the pick that the Giants just made, I hope things work out well for the Giants this year, because that would be best for Jackson Dart.
I agree, and I know that people may, especially in the New York, New Jersey area, New York Giants fans, maybe there's I haven't gauged this because I'm not keeping up with the Giants on a regular basis on the level you are, Ed, but I would imagine that there's a contingent of people that would have liked to have seen Shane and Dable leave, and they would have
Mhm.
liked to let them go. But I would argue that it would be that the fact that they gave them 1 more year is an admission that that Daniel Jones was a big part of why this didn't work out, and what you explained why with Daniel Jones was also a factor, So, they're giving them an opportunity to say, "Okay, you think we can be a better product if you get a couple of veterans and the team that you've built thus far with Jones gone? Let's see you do it." And maybe they'll buy more time that way. All I'll say is this: you may go good riddance to Brian Dable, but Brian Dable is going to get a coaching job or a high end and get a good coordinator job in the NFL when after they fire him. When a job
Mhm.
comes open, he's going to get that opportunity again. Not because of just
Mhm.
the retread idea, because he's actually good. He's
Mhm.
actually good at what he's had. You have a I mean, if I'm gonna be like, if I was gonna be like talk how a lot of fans would, I would probably say, you know, if you look at this team, you've got an offensive line that has potential to be better if they're not banged up, and they were looking pretty good early in the season, but it didn't continue. You've got some promise on the defense. Um, you've got some promise with the run game. You have honestly one of the top 7 to 10 receivers in the league after his first year, who's only going to get better. You just re-signed a player who is probably a fourth or fifth receiver on other teams, in Darius Slayton. Not that he's not a pro caliber player and not that he's been able to step up and do things for the team, but realistically, you gave money to a guy who is is not really the ideal starter for you.
He's
Um,
not an ideal 2.
yeah, he's not an
Right.
ideal too, and you've got Wandale Robinson, who, to me is more of a gadget player who can give you slot work, and he's just good enough in the slot that that's fine. But your receivers aren't all that awesome outside of Malik Neighbors, and you, but and this is what Dable's been working with outside of 1 year of Malik Neighbors, and you're gonna you look at what he had in Buffalo, and I would say, early on they didn't have great receivers, and then they added Diggs, and then they got some things out of Davis. But if you look at Gabriel Davis, who just got cut today, by the way, from the Jaguars, Davis was a guy that they were able to manufacture things for. And guess who did the manufacturing? Ryan Dable and his staff. You know, they did the manufacturing to make this guy look really good when he couldn't catch a cold sometimes. Okay. He's a schemed Gabriel Davis is a schemed player. To me, that means that like you have to put all your resources in to getting him open and making him your primary target for him to win most of the time. And these are trick plays, constraint plays, play action throwbacks, things like that. Stefon Diggs is a matchup player like Malik Neighbors. You put him here and say, run that route against the best corner, 3rd and 17, and get me 17. And everyone in the stadium knows it, and he's going to do it. And that's not Davis. So you have one player like that on your team, and you didn't have a quarterback who was good enough to really take that to the next level. So I think I would love to see Dable get another 2, 3 years. I know fans are probably in an uproar the idea of that, but give him 2 to 3 years and let him either develop Dart or get his guy next year if they feel like Dart really isn't that guy.
All right. Well, Matt, we will see. We will see what happens. We'll cross our fingers that this works for the New York Giants because God knows I'm tired of talking about bad football and bad quarterback play. So anyway, I appreciate the time and the insight as always. Just real quick, let people know what you got going on, where they can find you.
Sure. I have my site, the rookie scouting portfolio, mattwaldmanrsp.com, or you can go to mattwaldman.com, and that's where you can buy the rookie scouting portfolio where do scouting reports on quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. I just put out the post draft RSP that analyzes the fit of these players and their value. If you're a fantasy player, I give a cheat sheet that's pretty detailed and cool for folks to do their fantasy drafts with. And of course, I'm the senior staff writer at Football Guy since 2009. I'll be starting to put out rankings and information, out and doing write ups on players coming in June.
All right, Matt. Thank you as always for the insight. We'll look forward to who knows, it might maybe we'll try to have you on sometime before next year's draft, or before the rookie scouting portfolio comes out again, or before your draft guide comes out again next year. Instead of this this once a year, generally what it comes to are once a year conversations with you.
Sure.
So,
Well, it's fun nonetheless, and I look forward to the next time we can get together.
all right. Giants fans, thank you as always for watching. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.